Heavy tanks are a very, very specialist kind of vehicle. They're very expensive to maintain and operate, let alone design and produce. And so, for many nations, this is simply way too expensive to do. As an example, Britain, who first started building heavy tanks in the first place, actually decided to move away from the concept in the interwar years and focus on medium, but mostly actually light tanks. If you are building heavy tanks, then you need to be really, really careful and make sure that you get something that you actually can build and can use, which is why the USSR found itself in a situation by 1939 where it had three competing heavy tank designs, all of which were fighting for the crown of being the Red Army's next generation heavy tank. But before we get to that, let's rewind a little bit and talk about why it actually ended up being like that and how come the T-35 became unsatisfactory. Well, the T-35 was envisioned in the late 1920s. At the time, the most powerful enemy tank was this. This is a British medium tank armed with a 3-pounder gun. This gun can penetrate at most about 30 millimeters of armor. And so the breakthrough tank needed, well, only 30 millimeters of armor, since that was as much as any enemy tank could put up against it. The Spanish Civil War showed that this assumption no longer held true. Almost a decade after the T-35 was envisioned, the anti-tank armament used by the USSR's enemies, well, improved. The German 37mm anti-tank gun could penetrate considerably more than 30 millimeters of armor, making the T-35 obsolete. It could no longer penetrate enemy defenses, which were now saturated with powerful anti-tank weapons. What do you do then? Well, you put more armor on the tank, but this wasn't really possible with the T-35. As I mentioned in my video about applique armor, the T-35 was designed at 50 tons by 1938-39. It actually weighed about 55 tons, and so you couldn't really put any more strain on the engine. An 800 horsepower engine was supposed to be developed for this tank to make it capable of carrying more armor, but it was never built, and so the 500 horsepower M17 really struggled with the tank's existing weight, let alone anything more. The multiple turrets of the T-35 were also a relic of the 1920s. The idea was that a tank with multiple turrets could engage multiple targets at the same time. And since the T-35 was a breakthrough tank, and it was probably going to end up right in the middle of enemy fortifications, shooting every which way, the ability to engage multiple targets was actually really, really useful. Another reason was that at the time, you could either have a high caliber but low velocity gun that could fire powerful HE shells to destroy fortifications, or a low caliber high velocity gun that could destroy enemy tanks. There was no weapon that could give you both. And so the main turret of the T-35 tank had a 76mm gun, a short low velocity gun that was powerful enough to destroy earth and wood fortifications, and the smaller turrets had 45mm guns. These guns were powerful enough to destroy enemy tanks, but much less effective against fortifications. So with this kind of layout, the T-35 could defend itself from threats coming at it from every direction, while the main turret was busy destroying enemy fortifications and allowing Red Army infantry to break through. Now, there weren't any heavy tanks used in the Spanish Civil War. In fact, there weren't really heavy tanks used in combat ever since the First World War. And so there wasn't really a way to find out how well this multi-turreted design was going to perform in a real battle. And so, because of experience in fighting, the armor thickness was ordered to be increased from 30 millimeters to 60 millimeters. But this multi-turreted layout remained because there was no reason to get rid of it. However, it seems that the Red Army tank branch did start to suspect something because it ordered the reduction of the total number of turrets from 5 to 3. Now you would have one central turret with a 76mm gun and two smaller turrets, one on the front and one on the back, with 45mm guns. There were two competing designs presented in 1938. There was Factory 185's T-100 and Kira Factory's SMK-1. Both the T-100 and SMK were fairly similar. Both were built to specifications at the time, But as legend has it, when presented with wooden models of these tanks, Stalin personally took off one of the 45mm gun turrets and said, "There's no point making a supermarket out of this tank. This turret weighs, what, 3 tons? Put it towards the armor instead." And, well, there's no way to tell whether or not that actually happened, but the actual T-100 and SMK tanks built in metal did in fact only have 2 turrets, and, well, they were still actually quite heavy. The 60 millimeters of required armor all around increased their weight for the SMK to 55 tons and the T-100 to 58 tons. This was an issue because these tanks were either as heavy or even heavier than the T-35, but they were going to have an 850 horsepower GAM-34 engine, so, well, it was better than the T-35's 500 horsepower, so they could really get away with that kind of increase in weight. Kiev factory went one step further when it came to reducing the weight by making a tank called KV. The KV combined the 76mm and 45mm guns into just one turret. This allowed them to make the tank both shorter and lower, and considerably saved on weight. Even though the KV had more armor than the SMK, 75mm all around instead of 60, the KV-1 weighed just 40 tons. Well, nominally, the actual prototype was 42 tons, but still very, very compact, but yet very heavily armored vehicle. Factory 185 tried to do the same thing. Their tank was called 050. Makes sense. 100 divided by 2 is 50. This tank, much like the KV, would weigh around 40 tons. It had one turret with a 76mm gun and a 45mm coaxial gun. Interestingly enough, the coaxial gun could be swapped out for a 12.7mm machine gun. But unfortunately, this tank was never built. Factory 185 made its bet on the multi-turret concept, and the T-100 was the only prototype heavy tank they produced. So in the end, prototypes of 3 heavy tanks were built: the KV, the SMK, and the T-100. Since the Winter War broke out around that time, it seemed like a perfect opportunity to test these tanks in combat rather than on the proving grounds, and so all 3 prototypes were sent to the front lines as a part of the Special Tank Company. All 3 tanks went into battle on December 19, 1939, and while they were quite successful, their thick armor was impervious to finished 37mm anti-tank guns, and they succeeded in a breakthrough towards Vyborg, where Soviet attacks previously failed. However, there was a little bit of a snag. Soviet infantry did not support the tank attack, and the breakthrough petered out. This was unfortunate for the Soviet strategic situation, but also specifically for the tank branch because the SMK hit a mine and it was actually immobilized behind enemy lines. There was a mission that was organized to evacuate the secret tank. The mission failed, and so it just kind of sat around there until March when the armistice was signed. It was too heavy for the Finns to evacuate as well, but at the very least they could inspect it and take photos of it and pass that information on to the Germans. And so the German report on Soviet armor in 1941 actually includes a mysterious tank called T-35C. The Germans didn't know what the name of this tank was, but they could figure out that it was somehow related to the T-35. There are some say that it was this episode that sealed the fate of the KV-1 as the winner of this 3-way contest, but, well, actually the decision was made on December 19th, 1939, on the exact same day that the tanks first saw battle. There's no way that the performance in the front lines could have possibly had any effect on the conclusion made by Stalin, and so, well, the tank's participation in the Winter War didn't actually play a major role in the selection of what tank would be accepted into service as the Red Army's next generation heavy tank. Factory 185 was down, but not yet out, since there was a second chance for their T-100 tank design. The problem was that the Red Army soon ran into the Mannerheim line, a very powerful series of Finnish fortifications that, well, the 76mm gun, the high explosive power, was enough to fight some dugouts and wooden earthworks fortifications, but when it came to the concrete bunkers of the Mannerheim line, it was way too much for it to handle. A more powerful gun on a tank was needed, and it was needed urgently. And this was a chance for the T-100 to redeem itself. There were actually several designs that Factory 185 put out, numbered with Latin characters for some reason. T-100 X, Y, and Z. T-100Z was kind of similar to the KV-2, which we'll talk about later. It had a new turret with a 152mm M10 howitzer in it. This turret was actually built, but Factory 185 was not allowed to install it on their tank because their chassis was destined to be reused to make an engineering vehicle, and so it was actually used as a part of fortifications around Leningrad later. Factory 185 didn't give up actually on this concept and tried to rebrand it and market it to the Navy as a coastal defense tank. This tank was called T-103, and it was armed with a 130mm naval gun, but this project only got as far as a wooden model. The Navy didn't really want it either. Now, T-100X and T-100Y were probably more interesting, particularly the T-100Y. Instead of a rotating turret, it had a fixed casemate, and rather than a 152mm gun, it used a slightly smaller but higher velocity 130mm, the same naval gun that would later be put into the T-103. The 130mm gun arguably made it a more useful bunker buster than the KV-2's 152 because high velocity is very important when you're penetrating concrete or when you're shooting at targets very, very far away. These guns could have ranges of dozen kilometers or so if you're shooting it at a high enough elevation angle. The T-100Y might have actually had a chance at life, if not for one small problem. It was only finished after the Winter War ended. The Red Army actually refused to pay for it, and there was a little scandal that erupted over that. That didn't mean that the tank directorate was completely disinterested. The T-100Y actually continued trials throughout the summer of 1940, but it's kind of made clear that it was not up to par. It wasn't particularly interesting, and the sole prototype was left at the Kubinka Tank Museum. Kirov Factory picked an easier route. They simply replaced the turret on one of the KV prototypes with a larger one and put a 152mm howitzer in it. This tank, you probably know it as the KV-2. Its main advantage over the T-100Y was that it was actually finished in time to fight. Two prototypes were actually finished, not just one. They went into battle starting in late February of 1940, and they actually had quite a significant success in the battlefield. This gun, the gun that they had, could destroy concrete fortifications, making them quite a useful breakthrough tank, especially combined with the thick 75mm armor that made them pretty much invulnerable to enemy weapons. And so by the summer of 1940, both the KV tank with the small turret and 76mm gun, later known as KV-1, and the KV tank with a large turret and 152mm gun, later known as KV-2, cemented themselves as the superior vehicles over both Kirov Factory's SMK and Factory 185's T-100. Now, you might be wondering what all this gameplay footage that I'm showing you is from. It's from a new free-to-play tank game called Steel Aces by Armative Studios. I just entered closed beta, and so if you're interested in a tank game that was made from the ground up with no pay-to-win elements, where you can actually, when you drive a tank, it feels like you're driving a tank as opposed to a race car with a gun, and every game mechanic is based on actual archival research, which I also took a part in, then I highly suggest you sign up and check it out.